Let's rock.
I'm going to be introducing Dilber Mann, and he's going to give us a look into metrics that matter. Dilber is a development director at Relic Entertainment. Since 2006, Dilber has worked on-site with partners in China to build their capability to support the needs of multiple game studios. So give it up for Dilber.
Welcome, everyone, to the XDS metrics track. How many of you actually have ever met me or know me in person? Just put your hands up really quick. OK, great, because I'm going to make it a little bit more eye contact with you guys. And in the middle of the presentation, we're going to make a human pyramid. So yeah, I'll need you two especially to be part of the foundation of that. So I'm not joking, really, no. So I'm here to talk about the metrics that matter. So now, we've all had to make decisions and considerations about scope and budget and how much to allocate to external development projects. And we're going to talk a bit more about how to establish reliable metrics for making informed decisions about project planning. So before I continue, I want to give you a bit of context and understanding about the materials that we're going to present, or that I'm going to present today. And a lot of it has to do with the different perspectives and roles that I've had over the many years. And publishing and corporate publishing is one of the important areas that I had an opportunity to work in, as well as on-site partner vendor management and on the studio development side as well. So I actually started out at Activision Publishing, where I had a great opportunity to go out to an external partner in China at the time to build up a team to 100+ resources for half a dozen projects over a 6-month period. And that was during the console transition from Xbox to Xbox 360. And again, it was a great opportunity to get in touch with these 3 different perspectives. Now, after that, I moved to THQ Publishing, and I spent several years at corporate, still in external development capacity. And later, I relocated to THQ Shanghai in China to work directly with our partner vendors. And I see a few of them here in the crowd as well, so great to see you. And back then, we had to manage about 300+ resources over half a dozen locations for a dozen projects. So it was quite a complex and extensive operation. After that, I moved to this side of the world and was situated at Relic Entertainment by THQ. And one of my goals was to help support the studio with their outsourcing pipeline, streamline their processes, and help them grow on the external development side. Now, just as a side note, as you know, THQ is no longer around, and Relic is now part of Sega, so we are now a Sega Studio. But right there, in terms of my background, I've just talked about 3 different perspectives or roles, from corporate publishing to studio development to a on-site vendor management. So just want to know from the crowd, how many of you are from a corporate publishing or a central position? Just raise your hands. OK, good, good. And how many of you from a studio development role? Raise your hands. OK, good. And how many of you from a vendor role where you're offering external development services? Raise your hands. OK, good, good. So there's a really good sampling in the crowd here, and definitely I think what we're going to talk about today is going to resonate with each and every one of your groups. And so definitely there's a benefit I think you're going to get. So today I'm going to cover establishing some foundation metrics, and I'm going to talk a little bit about cost savings. I'm also going to talk about how to build on top of cost savings to build scalability metrics. And that's really related to what I like to call stakeholder metrics. and also talk a little bit about buy-in from your management to help support your external development process and your department. Afterwards, I'm going to apply the scalability metrics we talk about today onto real-world examples for projects that I've actually worked on. And after that, I'm going to look at taking the metrics and converting them over to key performance indicators that you can use to track your goals during production. So, cost savings analysis. Just curious, everyone here heard about cost savings analysis or have been involved in cost savings analysis as it pertains to external development? Is anyone raise your hands if you're familiar with the? Can anyone explain what cost savings analysis is? Okay, essentially, cost savings analysis is a comparison between two types of rates: an internal studio rate and an external rate. So I just want to clarify that. And the rate involves a resource salary plus an overhead for the studio or for the vendor. And that's how the rates are compared. So mandate rate comparisons is a way to develop cost savings analysis. We will take a look at scope and multiply our mandate rates against the projected scope as well. And we'll take a look at how studio support can impact cost savings analysis. So really quickly here, I have a comparison between vendor rate and studio rate. And right away, the scale is showing a 71% savings. Now, just want to clarify that these are just example numbers. The rates that you see here don't reflect any studio or any vendor's rates. It's just an example for today. On the right-hand side here, you'll see that in purple, I have a vendor rate, and in the red there, I have a studio rate. So the rate I'm using for the vendor rate is more for a overseas vendor or a low-cost center. So for you guys, it all depends on the project, what the external rate is. But what we're trying to do here is do a cost savings comparison and analysis. One thing that's very, very different about an external rate versus an internal rate that I want to bring to your attention is management infrastructure. Often, internal rates don't include scalable infrastructure costs. And so let me explain that a little bit. If you had 3 character artists, for example, working on 3D characters, 2 of them might be artists, 1 of them might be an art lead. And all 3 of them are building assets for you. But the art lead, at some point, will slowly transition into a 100% management role. And the reason for that is if your project scales up and your team grows bigger, your external team, then the art lead will eventually transition over to managing the team, the expectations, QA, that sort of thing. And so it's not really an issue of external development. It's more of a result of scalability. And so we include that in the rate for a vendor rate. So if you're working with a vendor and they don't include this in there and they're charging you more, then that's kind of a question that you need to ask them, because many of the vendors that I've worked with over the past decade, they always include infrastructure support as part of the mandate rate. Now with the internal rate for your studio, I'm sure you're talking to your finance director or someone in a similar role. They're going to give you a rate that's the resource rate. And in this case, I'm mostly focusing on art resource rates. So they're going to give you an internal art resource rate, and then they're going to add their overhead. But they're not looking at how internally scalability will require the resource rate to add additional art lead management or art management support. So I've added that in here by adding 10% to the internal mandate rate. So whatever that number is, add 10%. And what that means is for every 10 resources that you have, your lead will transition from an asset creation role to a management role. So that's one consideration. Next step for cost savings analysis is scope. So you can add a scope in there in terms of man days or man months and multiply it against the rate. and you'll come up with a number on both the vendor side and on the studio side, and you can compare the difference. Now, I just want to mention really quickly about the scope in here. I have it one-to-one in that I'm comparing an internal scope with an external scope, but often I hear studios say that their external resources are a little bit slow. So there's some performance efficiencies there that they want to include in the analysis. And I'll hear something like 10% slower, 50% slower. So if you want to add that into your analysis, feel free to do so. For the most part, I don't. I leave the scope the same for when I'm comparing internal and external. And the reason for it is that, especially specifically to my studio, we don't handle large-scale production in terms of having hundreds, 200, 300 artists. Our team is very, very small. So when we're looking at comparing our internal speed to an external speed, we're not considering that if we had to scale internally, the team wouldn't all be art leads. So they wouldn't all be principal artists. We have to look at having a balance in terms of the skill set and experience of the resources that we would hire for scalable production. And that's the reason why I don't change the scope. But if you feel that you need to, you can reduce that on the studio side to take into account the change in or the inefficiency or the slowness or performance of an external team. So the last part, so up until now, we're still looking at a 71% savings in this example. No matter what numbers you plug in, at this point, you'll always see really high savings between an internal and external rate if you're working with a low-cost center, whether locally or overseas. But one thing that people often are afraid to add is the cost of the studio to support external development. So I have here just an example. I've plugged in a number there, 250K, right below there. Now, this can include 1 to 3 resources, some travel budget, anything where a art lead has to provide feedback or prepare job sheet materials or art direction to go out to an external team to help plan or to help to establish a pipeline or tools for the external team on site. All those costs, you can throw in the kitchen sink as well. It should all go in there under studio support. And once you have that number in, your cost savings percentage changes significantly. And in the case of this example, it's closer to about 58%. So we went from 70+% down to about 50, 60%. Now, this is just an example. I'll talk a little bit later about what more realistic range should look like for working with a low-cost center. But it's going to be different for every studio. So I want to talk a little bit about different things that can impact cost savings analysis that aren't normally considered. And one of the things you should consider is how you schedule your external development. So this is a clear curve of a ramp up and a ramp down chart for allocation of resources for an external project. And the reason why I have a ramp up is because we like to work with a small team at the beginning of our projects so that we can vet out the pipeline, vet out expectations on both sides, make sure everyone's on the same page, and that all the tools and pipeline are working. And once that's been vetted out, then we can move forward with ramping up the team for peak production. There's also a ramp down as well. And I like to ramp down a team for 2 reasons. One, the vendor that you're working with, they have a chance to slowly move their resources to other projects. So it reduces their idle time and it keeps their mandate rate to a reasonable level so that they're not incorporating high levels of idle time into the project or idle that they're expecting between your project and another. The second reason is that often when we schedule external development, it really lines up with our internal schedule where we have a finishing date or an alpha date or a content complete date near the end of our external development. So they kind of start to line up. And what we don't want is our external team offering large volumes of content. So we don't want them to submit that to us near the end of production when we're looking to go through content complete phase for our project. So, because that'll just impact the internal team. There's a potential that a large amount of assets can impact your game. QA may find some issues, design may have to make some changes potentially. So we want to reduce the risk. Oops. So in this example, the way to look at it is that 50% of the man effort or manpower that you're assigning to your external development project, it's spread across 3 months of work during peak time. 3 months of your schedule during peak time. If we compress this schedule to about 6 months, you're going to see that you're going to need more resources to handle a large amount of work over a shorter period of time. So we're looking at about 50% of the manpower spread across 2 months. Now, the graph I showed you previously, that was a graph that represents about 10 to 13 resources at peak. When you get to this point, or you even compress the schedule even further, the resource can peak up to 40 or 40 plus in this example. So compressing it down to 4 months, 50% of your manpower is now spread across 6 weeks of work, or of the schedule. So you're further compressing the schedule and your peak team size continues to grow. That can be problematic. And in fact, that's what's going to impact your cost savings analysis. So that number you have for studio support, it's going to go up. So the studio support number that I put in there is typically for a structure where you have an art outsource manager to manage your feedback turnaround and preparing job sheets, that sort of thing. Well, one person can't manage this volume of work. Potentially they can manage about 10 external resources worth of work, but not 40. At that point, you need to add more people to support your external development effort. And again, that will impact your cost savings analysis. Oh, I have a disclaimer in here just showing that the percentages may not add up to 100% across month to month in my graphs, and that's just because there's a little bit of contingency in place, because we can't always equate resource manpower with the asset mandate effort that we need, and so there's a little bit of contingency for buffer. So it may all add up to 110%, 120%. The more you compress your schedule, the more contingency buffer I would recommend you have. So the other thing that can impact your cost savings analysis is resource productivity. Internally in our studio, if we hire somebody brand new, we don't expect them to be 100% efficient. And so what I mean by that is if a person comes in and they're potentially 50% productive, that would mean that a character that would take 1 month may take 2 months to complete and finish. So the way that I plan external development is that in the first month, a new resource will be 50% productive. In the second month, they've got a little bit more experience on the project and familiar with the IP and the tools. And so I bump them up to 70%, and eventually I peak them out at about 80%. The other 20% typically is for art reviews, discussion with your coworkers, QA, that sort of thing. So that's generally how I manage production. Now, the reason I bring it up is because if you're doing a contract where your vendor is bidding by asset man days, so they're saying a character will cost you 20 man days worth of work, an environment maybe 10, a vehicle maybe 10, then if they're using man days to charge you, then this is a savings that you're going to get because you're not bidding by headcount. You're not hiring the headcount and incurring the cost of these inefficiencies that potentially could occur when you have new resources on the project. So include that into your cost savings analysis as well as a consideration. Now, my personal recommendation is to do both. Start a project off with a bid by asset mandate, 1 or 2 milestones, and then move into a bid by headcount scenario when they're ramped up, the team is ramped up, and you're feeling more confident and familiar with the team. This works really well if your project is 6 months or longer. I tend to generally use just bid by asset mandate if it's a very short contract because we can never get the productivity up because we're constantly ramping up the team, and by the time we've ramped them up, the project is practically over. So it works better when you have longer durations of time scheduled for external development. So I just want to touch a bit about the numbers that you saw initially for the cost savings for the chart that I had up there. It's good. It's okay to have a lower cost savings when you're working with a low cost center or overseas cost center. My experience is working mostly with vendors in China. So it can be reflected, it's reflected here in the chart that I showed you previously. But 35% to 50% cost savings, it's not so bad. In fact, even going down to 30% is not that bad. And it varies depending on the category of work, whether it's 3D work or 2D work or like 2D concepting or animation. It can vary. But don't get dismayed when you see a low cost savings percentage. In fact, does it even really matter? I've talked to a lot of different studios over the years about cost savings, and I find a lot of people say it's not that important. In fact, I've had producers say to me, that number can be 0 for all they care. So, and the reason for that is because we haven't considered other stakeholders that are in our organization and what their concerns are and why they want to outsource. And that's where we talk about scalability metrics. And scalability metrics are based off of the different stakeholders in your organization and what their concerns and needs are. So we build that on top of the cost savings analysis. So once you've done a proper cost savings analysis, start to talk to people in your organization about what they are concerned about in terms of performance and the reasons why they outsource. And you'll start to build up an understanding of the types of metrics you need to track. Now, for today, I'm going to show you 3 scalability metrics that we potentially are using to track different stakeholders' metrics. And they all mean a little bit different to different people. So an art lead may not be as concerned about these metrics as would a GM or a producer or an art director. So let me just go through this really quickly. So the first scalability metric is man effort established. And what that actually tracks is, so I've been talking about art budget specifically and art outsourcing. So what this actually tracks is the studio art budget plus the external development budget, and it calculates against the mandate rates that you have for internal and external, and you can find out what your potential man effort is that you're using for the project. And so it just checks for the percentage of effort that you're establishing externally. This is a really good metric, actually, because it shows how much infrastructure we need to support for that external team. So if your number is like 10% of your man effort established externally, and if you're even doing full development, for example, it's a lot. If it's more complicated of a outsourcing project, then you can get an indication that your internal team, for the 90% of the man effort you're doing internally, that there's a certain level of infrastructure that you have in place to support them. So you can start to get an indication of what needs to be done for that 10% that you're outsourcing with an external team. And then you can also evaluate how much of your external team is supporting their own team, like your external vendors infrastructure, and how much of it is in there. And if there's any deficiencies or anything that's lacking, you can help support that as well with your own team. Added value is more about how much added man effort is being added to the project by outsourcing. So it takes a look at the budget for the internal art resources and external art resources. And then it asks the question that if we combine that budget together and multiplied it or divided it against the mandate rate, our internal mandate rate, then what would the difference be in terms of potential man effort that we could produce for the project when we compare it against an external and an internal plan for the project? So it just takes a look at what we can add in terms of additional man effort by outsourcing. And the third metric is budget savings. So this is very interesting. What it does is this metric looks at the potential man effort that you can get from an internal art budget plus the man effort you can get from an external art budget. Combine that together and ask the question, what would it cost to do that amount of scope internally? So you multiply it against your internal rate, and you'll come up with a number. And you can compare it against the number that you have for your plan to outsource plus your internal art budget. And then the difference there is really saying, if we do all the work, the current planned work internally, we would have to increase our budget by this much percentage. And so that's what it's saying. It is also saying, too, that if we outsource, then we're potentially saving this much on our budget. So that's kind of a breakdown of the 3 scalability metrics. So the next step is really, once you establish your stakeholder metrics or scalability metrics, the next step is to chart it over different scalable scopes. So what I have here on the bottom is 1,000 to 10,000 man days worth of work. And on the left-hand side, I have the percentage of metrics. So you can see right off from the beginning at 1,000 man days of work, there isn't really any added value metric there. Essentially, it's 0. So the gist of this graph is showing that, or this chart is showing that the more scope you do, the better or higher your scalability metrics will go. And so you'll get more advantage by doing more work, essentially. But the reason why I have this chart is because when you get to this step, you need to determine where your diminishing returns will be. And so I just kind of highlighted in gray there at about the 7,000 man day mark for this chart, where we're starting to see diminishing returns. Now, this could be different for any of you if you calculate this. It doesn't represent my studio, but the percentages do represent closely to what we're seeing. So I'll talk about the percentages a little bit later. You can consider this a threshold or an optimum level that you can get to with scalability metrics. So I'll talk a bit more in detail as I continue with the presentation. So getting buy-in with your team or your studio, cost savings is, the point I want to make is cost savings is just the beginning. It's not as important to everyone in the organization as you think. Know who your stakeholders are within your studio that have an impact on decisions to outsource, and talk to them. Find out what they're looking for in terms of a metric that they can use to calculate performance or their goals. And expand your data analysis to include multiple KPIs or multiple metrics, not just cost savings analysis. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a case study that reflects some of the projects that we had at Relic Entertainment. And I'm not going to talk specifically about what project is what, but I'm going to cover the metrics that were involved in the project. So what I've done is I've taken the scalability metrics that we just talked about and mapped them against several projects that we've done over the few years. And but before I get into that, I want to talk about a step-by-step process that we went through to improve performance over time. And so if you're starting for the first time, you're outsourcing for the first time, or you haven't grown your scale of your outsourcing, I'd recommend these steps. So step 1 is conventional outsourcing. Now, anyone here know what conventional outsourcing means? I just want to make sure that we're on the same page in terms of terminology. Has everyone heard the term conventional outsourcing? Okay. So conventional outsourcing is basically what we used to do about 10 years ago, where we'd have art, we'd have reference material, maybe a few bullet points, and we give it out to an external team to start working on an asset. There was not a lot of exporting tools or game engine or internal pipeline in place to really understand the context of the asset. So it's okay to do conventional art outsourcing to start off with, but when you increase your scope to a large team size or for a large amount of man days, just be careful of the potential issues that can come up. And so this is something we encountered at Relic as well, is where we started to do a significant amount of scope, and we realized that our external team did a great job. The art was great, but when we got it back, there was a bit of a disconnect because they didn't understand the context of how the asset was being used in engine. And we didn't explain it very well in our art direction or our job sheets that we sent out to them. And it's very hard to explain when you don't have the engine in front of you, or for an art team that's external, it's very hard for them to understand the context if they don't have the game engine. So we transitioned after that to distributed development. And this is where we're trying to extend our team beyond our studio to another team. Basically creating an extension of our own team by offering the same pipeline, same tools, as much as we can, the same infrastructure that we have in place internally to an external team. And we found a lot of improvements in terms of our scalability metrics and compared to just doing conventional art outsourcing. And the third step that we took was to dissolve the art outsource manager role. So I'm here, and my role is not dissolved, but what I'm talking about for art outsource manager role is that the person that looks at feedback or looks at art assets and gives feedback or provides feedback, creates job sheets, helps support the external team with their tools and pipeline. That person that you have in place, that's the role that we dissolved. And I'll explain a little bit later why we did that. So here are the scalability metrics mapped against one of our projects. And this is a project we did a few years back. I'm calling it Project A. It used conventional art outsourcing. And you can see that the metrics aren't that impressive. Our man effort established is at about 20%. Our added value metric is at about 8%. And our budget savings is at about 13%. After this project, we did distributed development. We started to incorporate our pipeline and our tool. We spent the time to set it up with our external team, and they worked in the same manner that our internal team was working to produce assets, test them in engine, set them up, and that whole integration process really helped with the metrics. So you can see the man effort established increased a little bit by about 6% or 5%. The added value metric stayed pretty low, and the reason for that is because we spent a lot of effort to support the change that we made with distributed development. So we had a little bit higher studio support costs. Budget saving metrics, however, increased significantly during this project. So I want to mention with Project B that we had 35% less scope than Project A, but we were still able to maximize our efficiencies across these three scalability metrics. So that was a really big win for us. So then the question really came up was, what was our goals? Where do we want to be for our next project? And this is where Project C comes up. So I've actually added the metrics from the chart previously. That was our threshold or our point of diminishing returns. And I placed them here. We haven't decided as a studio what we actually want to do or what our goals are for these metrics yet. But what we did realize was that the higher our man effort established number went, the more we needed to provide studio support. So when I talk about the charts previously where we had 10 resources at peak, and then you shrunk the schedule to 6 months, and then to 4 months, and then we had 40 people at peak. We realized that one art outsource manager just couldn't handle all that work. And the higher we went in terms of man effort established from project A, project B, and to these metrics, we realized that it's just pointless to have one person do all the work, because eventually in the end, across the last 2 projects, project A and B, we ended up having art leads help support our art outsource manager. And so near the end of project B, we dissolved the whole point of having that position, and we put art leads in place to help support the project. It's just too much for one person to handle. So the idea we have right now is if we do large-scale production and we do have a significant man effort established externally, then we want to give the responsibility to the art leads. And it's not really a result of external development, it's a result of scalability again. If we had to do the same thing internally and we hired 10 people for the character team, or 10 people for the environment team, 10 people for the animation team, the lead will end up eventually taking responsibility over managing that team and probably spend a lot less time building actual assets. So we put it upon the individual departments within our studio to manage their respective teams. And so that's the idea that we're considering right now. So we have metrics, but what do we do with them? A number can mean just about anything, 20%, 30%, 4, 5, 12. Like, what does it actually mean? My recommendation here is, for the next step, is to transition metrics into actionable metrics that you can see very quickly what the performance is telling you. Like, is it normal performance? Is it underperforming? That sort of thing. And why do we want to do this? It's just so you can keep track of your goals. Once you establish what your goals are, keep track of them during production. And the way you do it is to continue to update your data. You're talking to your finance director, that's where most of your data is coming from. Just continue to update your numbers, plug it in, and continue to take a look at your metrics. So let's take a look at what KPIs are. And what it stands for is key performance indicators. We have a number that we use as an indicator of performance. Yes, metrics can do that only if you know what the data actually means. In the case of a KPI, we take those metrics and we scale them to a range of 0 to 100%. And where 100% plus is considered outperforming performance. Where 75% to 100% is normal performance. Where anything between 50 and 75 is considered underperforming. And anything less than 50% requires some sort of escalation. So this way it's very easy to quickly see on a dashboard of metrics, for these scalability metrics, what's going well and what's not going well. So it doesn't matter what stakeholder you are in the company or whoever you are in the organization, you don't need to know what the actual metric numbers are. You just need to know what the KPI is telling you. So I'm just quickly showing a formula to convert your metrics into KPIs. It can be very complex depending on what your minimum range, what you consider your minimum performance and what your maximum is. But just very simply, I had the added value metric of 20% at peak for optimum metric for project C. So I just multiplied that by 5 just to give us a 100% KPI. And the budget savings metric of 25% at peak for project C, I just multiplied that by 4 to 100% KPI. So these are my thresholds. I'm just taking my thresholds and converting them into a range of 0 to 100%. So I'm oversimplifying it a little bit here. 40% for the man effort established, I'm multiplying it by 2.5 to get 100% KPI. Hopefully my math is correct, but you can correct me if I'm wrong after. Now, I just applied those calculations against the metrics for project A, B, and C. And you can see very clearly what the result is. You know, red means that there's a problem. Yellow means that we're trending towards a serious issue. Green means that we're doing good. And this is a good way to track your performance for your scalability metrics. So I just want to recap really quickly what we were talking about today. We're looking at trying to establish a system of metrics that are reliable for us to make informed decisions about project planning. And just to give you a bit of details, again, for the summary, for cost savings analysis, stakeholder considerations, and decision-making KPIs, for cost savings analysis, I just want you to remember that scalable management and studio support should be considered in your cost savings analysis. Know that schedule compression has an impact on your cost savings analysis, and include productivity savings in your analysis as well. For stakeholder considerations, discuss. Talk to the people around you. Talk to the people in your studio. Find out who the stakeholders are. If you don't know, talk to design, talk to programming, talk to your GM, talk to your producers. Find out who they are and what their concerns are. Then prioritize their metrics. So speak, integrate, prioritize stakeholder metrics. And then for decision-making KPIs, know what your KPIs are telling you. Let people know what the definition of your KPIs are and what they're trying to tell you. Agree as an organization what KPIs are important as goals and what those goals are, what specific metrics are you looking to achieve. And then track your KPIs throughout production by converting your metrics over to key performance indicators. So that's it. Thank you for your time.